The Interstellar Survival Academy occupied a moon that nobody particularly wanted, which made it perfect for teaching the galaxy's future explorers how not to die on planets nobody particularly wanted to visit. Established some 200 cycles ago by a consortium of species who'd grown tired of rescuing their citizens from survival situations that could have been avoided with basic competence, the Academy had refined the art of controlled suffering into a precise science. They had protocols for dehydration, manuals for hypothermia, and a surprisingly thick binder on what to do when the local fauna decided you looked delicious. What they didn't have, apparently, was a protocol for humans doing things the complicated way when the simple way was sitting right there. Kethros 7 was the Academy's crown jewel of misery, a planet where everything that could go wrong had been carefully calibrated to go wrong at the most educationally valuable moment. The water was safe to drink but difficult to reach. The shelter materials were abundant but required actual effort to assemble. And the local fish population, silver-scaled creatures called quellfin that swarmed the shallow coastal pools, were simultaneously plentiful and maddeningly difficult to catch without proper equipment. The fishing challenge was mandatory for all third-cycle cadets. The rules were simple enough to fit on a data slate: spend 4 days on Kethros 7's eastern coastline, catch enough quellfin to feed yourself adequately, and demonstrate that you understood the relationship between caloric expenditure and nutritional intake. The Academy provided each cadet with a standard survival pack containing a collapsible fishing rod, synthetic line rated for 12 standard kilograms of tension, 3 types of lures calibrated for quellfin feeding patterns, and a water purification unit that doubled as a morale-boosting device by playing soothing nature sounds. Nobody had ever passed the challenge without the gear. Nobody had even tried, because trying would be stupid, and stupid got you recycled back to second cycle to contemplate your life choices. The current cohort of cadets represented 18 different species, each one bringing their own particular brand of environmental adaptation and cultural superiority to the sandy beaches of Kethros 7. There were Velcron, whose forearms made equipment handling trivially easy. There were Porathi, whose photographic memory meant they'd memorized every page of the survival manual including the typos. There were Jin, who could hold their breath for 40 minutes and were thus unofficially considered to be cheating at the fishing challenge, though nobody had proved it yet. And then there was Corporal Marcus Webb, human, who had the profound misfortune of being the only representative of his species in the entire Academy, which meant he got to be everyone's example of every human stereotype simultaneously. The transport shuttle deposited all 47 cadets on the beach at dawn, their survival packs secured, their confidence high, their understanding of irony about to be significantly expanded. Marcus hit the sand with his pack, watched the shuttle lift off with the kind of resignation usually reserved for tax audits, and proceeded to trip over a piece of driftwood approximately 4 seconds later. His survival pack tumbled from his grip, sailed through the air with the grace of a drunken satellite, and landed directly in a tidal pool with a splash that sent water 3 meters in every direction. The pack sank immediately, because of course it did. "Outstanding start, mammal," chittered Vextra, a Velcron whose translator gave her voice the pleasant tone of grinding metal. "Perhaps your species survives through comedic value. The predators laugh too hard to eat you, yes?" Several nearby cadets made sounds that their respective translators interpreted as laughter. Marcus waded into the tidal pool, found his pack wedged under a rock, and hauled it out to discover that water had gotten into everything. The fishing rod's collapse mechanism had corroded into a single immobile unit. The lures had dissolved into rainbow-colored sludge. The fishing line had somehow tied itself into a knot that would have impressed a Zin sailor. Even the water purifier was making a sad clicking sound that the soothing nature sounds couldn't quite mask. "Fantastic," Marcus muttered, dumping water out of his pack. "Love this for me." Lieutenant Caval, the Porathi instructor supervising this particular batch of potential survivors, observed the situation with all four of his eyes. "Corporal Webb, your equipment is compromised. Academy regulations require functional fishing gear for this challenge. I can request an emergency supply drop, but it will cost you a full cycle's worth of academic credits, and you'll need to repeat this module next quarter." Marcus looked at the destroyed fishing equipment. He looked at the quellfin darting through the tidal pools, their silver scales catching the morning light. He looked at the tree line about 30 meters up the beach, where twisted coastal shrubs grew in abundant clusters. "Nah," he said. "I'm good." Caval's translator hesitated, as if unsure it had processed the words correctly. "You are good? Corporal, the challenge requires catching fish. Plural. Multiple fish. Over 4 days. With what equipment do you intend to accomplish this?" Marcus was already walking toward the tree line. "I'll figure something out." The other cadets watched him go with the kind of attention usually reserved for impending disasters. Humans had a reputation in the academy, a reputation built on equal parts stubbornness and probability-defying survival outcomes. They were the species that had somehow colonized worlds that killed Velcrin within a week. They were the ones who'd look at a toxic atmosphere and say seems fine before developing completely unnecessary respiratory adaptations. They had no natural weapons, no specialized environmental advantages, and a baffling tendency to adopt predators as companionship animals. But they'd never fished without fishing gear. Nobody had. That was like trying to perform surgery without medical tools or navigate hyperspace without a computer. Technically possible in some theoretical sense, but practically absurd. Marcus found what he was looking for after about 10 minutes of searching, a coastal shrub with branches dense enough to resist the constant wind but flexible enough to work with. He pulled out his survival knife, the one piece of equipment that had survived the water incident by virtue of being actually waterproof, and started cutting. Back at the beach, the other cadets had begun setting up their fishing operations with the kind of efficiency that came from proper equipment and species-appropriate advantages. Vextra had her collapsible rod assembled in under a minute, all 4 hands working in perfect coordination. A Zin named Brolketh had already caught 2 quellfin by the deeply unfair method of holding his breath and grabbing them directly. Even Pixan, a diminutive Karathi whose species was generally considered too small for practical survival training, had her line in the water and was carefully monitoring the tension sensor on her rod. "Think the human will actually try to fish with his hands?" Vextra asked, casting her line with professional precision. "Humans lack the respiratory capacity for underwater pursuit," Broketh observed, water still dripping from his gill slits, "and their reflexes are insufficient for direct catching in tidal pools. He will likely forage for edible plants and attempt to pass the challenge on technicality." Carval, monitoring all the cadets from his observation post, made a note on his data slate. Humans were indeed excellent foragers, a skill they'd apparently developed before inventing actual civilization. It was a reasonable survival strategy, if somewhat embarrassing for a third cycle academy cadet. Marcus emerged from the tree line carrying an armful of branches and what appeared to be several pieces of bone from some long-dead creature. He sat down on a flat rock, pulled out his knife, and began whittling. "Is he crafting something?" Pixern's translator carried a note of genuine confusion. "Manual fabrication of tools," Carval said slowly. "A primitive skill. Humans apparently still practice it as a cultural tradition. But why?" Vexthra's lure had attracted a small school of quellfin, but they were being cautious, circling without biting. We have manufacturing technology. We have resource synthesis. Who makes tools by hand? Marcus, who was too far away to hear this conversation and probably wouldn't have cared anyway, had carved the first piece of bone into something resembling a hook. It was crude, rough around the edges, with a point that looked sharp enough to be functional. He set it aside and started on another, his hands moving with the kind of muscle memory that suggested he'd done this before, probably during some Earth childhood that involved significantly less technology than most species considered acceptable. The first day passed. Cadets caught fish with varying degrees of success. Vexthra landed 6 quailfin, all properly sized according to the sustainability guidelines in the manual. Broketh had 13, which nobody could technically complain about, since breath-holding wasn't explicitly forbidden. Pixern had 4, which for her body mass was actually excellent performance. Marcus had a growing collection of bone hooks, each one slightly more refined than the last, and 0 fish. He also had fashioned a length of cordage from plant fibers, a process that involved soaking, stripping, twisting, and the kind of patience that made watching it an exercise in existential frustration. By sunset, he had approximately 10 meters of rough but functional line. "He's going to starve," Vexthra announced to nobody in particular. "Humans need consistent caloric intake. 3 days without adequate food, and he'll be too weak to function." "Should we report this to command?" Pixern asked. "Watching a cadet fail is educational, but watching one suffer seems excessive." Cavil considered this. Academy regulations were clear: intervene only if life-threatening danger was present. Hunger was uncomfortable but not immediately lethal, and humans had documented resistance to short-term food deprivation. Besides, something about the way the human was working suggested a plan, however incomprehensible it might be. "We observe," Cavil decided. "If his condition deteriorates beyond acceptable parameters, we'll extract him." Day 2 began with Marcus attaching his bone hooks to his plant fiber line, using knots that looked absolutely terrible, but apparently held. He'd also carved what looked like a small spear from one of the larger branches. Its point fire hardened in his camp flame during the night. The quailfin in the tidal pools moved in predictable patterns, cycling between the deeper pools during high tide and the shallows during low tide. They fed on small crustaceans that lived in the rocks, which meant they congregated around specific areas where the rock formations created natural feeding grounds. Marcus had been watching these patterns for a day and a half. He waded into a tidal pool at mid-tide, when the water was deep enough to cover the rocks but shallow enough to see the bottom clearly. His improvised fishing line had no rod, just the line itself weighted with a small stone and baited with a piece of crustacean he'd caught by hand, a process that had taken 20 minutes and resulted in several pinches to his fingers. He cast the line, and cast was a generous term for what was essentially dropped the line in the water, and hoped and waited. Quailfin weren't stupid, but they also weren't smart enough to recognize unfamiliar danger. The bone hook looked nothing like the Academy's synthetic lures. It smelled different, moved differently, probably registered on some fish-level consciousness as weird, rather than artificial. One of the larger quailfin approached, curious. It nibbled at the bait. Marcus waited, every instinct screaming at him to pull the line, but Earth childhood memories of fishing with his grandfather insisted that patience was the actual skill being tested here. The fish took the bait. Marcus pulled. The plant fiber line held despite looking like it would snap at any moment, and suddenly he was hauling a thrashing quailfin out of the water using nothing but hand-over-hand pulling and sheer stubborn insistence that this was going to work. The fish landed on the sand. Marcus dispatched it quickly with his knife, the way his grandfather had taught him, the way humans had been doing for thousands of years before they'd invented agriculture or writing, or the philosophical debate about whether fish could feel pain. From the observation post, Cavill's data slate nearly slipped from his hands. Did he just? Pixon stared. Without a rod, without proper line, with a hook carved from bone. Impossible, Broketh said flatly. The tensile strength of organic cordage is insufficient for fish of that size. The mathematics don't support it. The human appears to have disagreed with your mathematics, Vextra observed, all four arms crossed in what her species considered a gesture of profound confusion. Marcus caught 3 more quellfin over the next 2 hours. The method was slow, required constant attention, and involved getting completely soaked in tidal pool water that probably contained 17 types of microorganisms that the Academy's medical staff would need to scan him for later. But it worked. In the same way that stone tools worked, or fire worked, or any of the other supposedly obsolete technologies that humans had carried with them from Earth, like cultural baggage that refused to be thrown away. By evening, he had enough fish for 2 days of meals. He'd built a proper fire using the friction method, another skill that made the other cadets watch with the horrified fascination usually reserved for medical procedures. He'd constructed a smoking rack from green wood to preserve the extra fish. He'd even fashioned a crude but functional cooking surface from flat rocks arranged around the fire. The smell of cooking quellfin drifted across the beach, and if smell could be translated into emotional states, this one would have read as deeply unfair. Vextra's high-tech lures had stopped working entirely on day 2. The quellfin had apparently learned to recognize them as dangerous, a problem that the Academy's equipment manufacturers had not anticipated. She'd caught 1 fish in the entire day. Pixan's delicate rod had broken when a larger-than-average quellfin had tested its limits and won. She was down to foraging and was currently trying to determine if a purple seaweed was edible or just looked edible, a distinction that mattered significantly. Even Broketh was struggling. The quellfin had apparently figured out that the large creature holding his breath in their pools was a threat, and they'd adapted by simply avoiding those pools entirely. Evolution was a harsh teacher, but it worked fast when survival was on the line. Marcus, meanwhile, was having dinner. A proper dinner. Hot food, adequate protein, enough calories to maintain body temperature through the chilly night. He'd even found some wild herbs growing near the tree line that tasted vaguely like rosemary, and had made the fish significantly less bland. "This is absurd," Vextra announced, stalking over to Marcus's camp with the kind of aggressive posture that suggested wounded pride. "How are you succeeding with primitive equipment when we have advanced technology?" Marcus looked up from his meal, genuinely surprised that this was even a question. "Your advanced technology is great when it works, but it's optimized for specific conditions. The fish adapted to your lures because they're artificial, predictable. My hooks are random, different every time, made from natural materials. The fish don't have an evolutionary response to them. That's not." Vextra paused. "That shouldn't matter." "But it does." Marcus gestured at his smoking rack, where tomorrow's meals were slowly preserving themselves. "You built your strategy around technology doing the work for you. I built mine around understanding what the fish actually do. Your gear is better than mine in every measurable way except the one that actually matters right now." Cavill had approached during this conversation, his 4 eyes taking in the camp, the fire, the successfully caught and prepared food, the humans sitting there looking tired and wet, and somehow completely fine. "Corporal Webb," Cavill said slowly, "you have fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of this exercise." Marcus blinked. "Have I?" Because I'm pretty sure the purpose was to catch enough fish to survive, which I'm doing. The purpose was to demonstrate equipment proficiency, resource management, and technological competence. With respect, Lieutenant, the manual said catch enough quailfin to feed yourself adequately. It didn't say how. Marcus held up one of his bone hooks. This is a tool. I made it from available resources. That's resource management. I figured out how to use it effectively. That's competence. The technology level is just a detail. The other cadets had gathered now, drawn by the conversation and possibly by the smell of actual cooked food. They looked at Marcus, at his primitive setup, at his successful catch of the day, and experienced the profound cognitive dissonance of watching someone succeed by ignoring all the advantages they'd been given. The Academy's entire curriculum is built on technological advancement, Cavill said. And there was a note in his translator that suggested he was having some kind of internal crisis about pedagogy. We teach cadets to use the best tools available. Sure, Marcus agreed. But what happens when the best tools aren't available? When they break, or get lost, or fall into a tidal pool because you tripped over driftwood like an idiot? He gestured at the surrounding cadets. Everyone here is great with their gear, but take the gear away, and what do you have? Silence answered him, the kind of silence that suggested uncomfortable philosophical implications. Day 3 proceeded with several cadets attempting to replicate Marcus's methods. Vextra tried to carve a bone hook and ended up with something that looked like abstract art. Pickstrat successfully made plant fiber cordage, but couldn't figure out the knots. Beeketh declared the entire exercise beneath his dignity and went back to holding his breath, even though the fish had clearly established a pattern of avoiding him. Marcus caught 6 more quailfin, shared 2 with Pickstrat, who was struggling with her broken equipment, and spent the evening explaining to a growing crowd of cadets exactly how grandfather taught fishing actually worked. It's about reading the environment, he said, pointing at the tidal pools. See how the water moves. That tells you where the fish feed. See how the rocks are arranged. That tells you where they hide. You can have the best fishing rod in the galaxy, but if you don't understand what the fish are doing, you're just throwing expensive equipment at the problem and hoping. But technology should eliminate the need for environmental reading. Vextra protested. That's the entire point of advancement. We develop tools so we don't have to rely on primitive observation skills. Until the tools fail, Marcus said, then the primitive observation skills are all you have left. And if you've never developed them because you relied on technology to do the thinking for you. He let the sentence hang because the beach full of cadets struggling to meet basic nutritional requirements finished the thought more effectively than words could. By day 4, the Academy staff had called an emergency curriculum review meeting. Cavill's report had triggered what the Porathi called a pedagogical crisis, which was their polite way of saying someone had accidentally discovered that their entire educational framework might have a significant blind spot. Marcus passed the challenge with the highest fishing efficiency rating in the cohort, a result that the Academy's computer system flagged as an error 3 times before accepting. He'd caught more fish with less equipment, using methods that predated most species' written history. The final evaluation took place in Cavill's office, a space that smelled like data slates and brewing existential concerns about educational philosophy. Corporal Webb, Cavill began. Your performance has raised questions. Good questions or bad questions? Marcus asked. Uncomfortable questions. Cavill pulled up a holographic display showing efficiency metrics across the entire cohort. You succeeded where technologically superior species struggled, using inferior tools. This suggests either a flaw in our training methodology or some unexplained human advantage we haven't documented. It's not an advantage, Marcus said. It's just, we never forgot the old ways. Humans spent thousands of years figuring out how to survive with nothing but rocks and sticks and stubbornness. When we developed better technology, we didn't throw away those skills. We kept them, taught them, practiced them, not because we needed to, but because forgetting how to survive without technology seemed like a really bad idea. Most species view primitive skills as obsolete, Cavell observed. Most species didn't evolve on a planet actively trying to kill them for entertainment value. Marcus shrugged. Earth made us paranoid about backup plans. We develop amazing technology, sure, but we also remember what to do when that technology breaks, because it will break. Eventually, and when it does, you need to know how to carve a fish hook and make fire and figure out dinner using whatever's available. Cavell made notes on his data slate, the kind of notes that would eventually become revised curriculum guidelines and mandatory training modules on primitive skill retention for technological failure scenarios. The Academy will be adding supplementary courses on low-technology survival methods, Cavell said finally. You'll be assisting with their development. Will I get extra credits for that? You'll get the satisfaction of ensuring your fellow cadets don't starve if their equipment fails. So no extra credits. No extra credits. Marcus left the office, walked back through the Academy's sterile corridors with their climate control and artificial gravity and all the technological conveniences that made space habitable for species from 1,000 different worlds. He passed Vexthra in the commissary, where she was eating synthesized protein with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent 4 days eating seaweed. "Hey Webb," she called out. "Next survival challenge, can you teach me that knot thing? The one that doesn't come undone." "Sure," Marcus said. "Bring some cordage to the practice grounds tomorrow. We have replicators. Can't I just fabricate pre-knotted line?" "You could," Marcus agreed. "But what happens when the replicator breaks?" Vexthra stared at him with all 4 eyes, processing this question in the context of recent traumatic fish-related memories, and slowly nodded. The Interstellar Survival Academy continued training the galaxy's future explorers in the art of controlled suffering and practical competence. They added new courses on primitive technology, backup skill development, and what the curriculum committee eventually titled Environmental Problem Solving Without Technical Dependencies. Enrollment in these courses was mandatory, much to the dismay of cadets who'd assumed that advancement meant leaving primitive methods behind. And somewhere in the Academy's archives, filed under notable student achievements, was a report about a human who'd carved fishhooks from bones and returned with dinner, proving that sometimes the most advanced survival skill was remembering how to survive when advancement wasn't an option. The galaxy had spent millennia developing technology to make survival easier. They'd succeeded spectacularly, creating tools and systems that could sustain life in environments that would kill organic beings in minutes. They'd become so good at survival through technology that they'd nearly forgotten how to survive without it. Humans, apparently, had never made that mistake. They'd reached for the stars while keeping one hand on a sharpened stick, just in case the stars turned out to be less friendly than advertised. Which, given the galaxy's track record, seemed like a reasonable precaution.